Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. Mark Davis, a 23-year-old law student, walked down the rain-soaked streets of a small college town in Texas. His backpack hung heavy on his shoulder, and the weight of the world seemed to press against him. Between juggling final exams, a part-time job, and mountains of debt left by his late father, Mark felt like he was drowning. Every step felt like a reminder that things weren't going to get better anytime soon. The constant stress had worn him down, and today felt no different. He glanced at his phone, seeing another notification for an overdue bill, and sighed. Then his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from an unknown number. He answered it, almost not caring anymore. A calm, authoritative voice spoke on the other end. Mark frowned. He had no idea who this woman was or how she knew about his financial struggles. He was about to hang up, but something in the way she spoke made him hesitate. The line went dead before Mark could protest. He stood there, staring at the phone for a moment, unsure of what just happened. Who was Eleanor Brooks, and why was she calling him about his finances? He glanced down at the street, rain still falling in thick sheets. He had nothing to lose, so he decided to go. Maybe this woman could offer him anything that would make this weight on his shoulders easier to bear. That evening, Mark arrived at the bistro, drenched from the rain. The warm glow of the bistro's lights invited him in. He stepped inside and shook off the cold, looking around for the woman who had called him. A waiter led him to a private corner where an elegant woman sat waiting. Her silver hair was neatly styled, and she wore a tailored suit that exuded wealth and authority. She looked up as he approached. He sat down across from her, unsure of what to expect. Her piercing blue eyes met his, and she didn't waste any time. Mark blinked, surprised by how much this woman seemed to know about him. He hadn't told anyone other than his mother about the financial hole he was in. Eleanor's next words took him even more off guard. Mark stared at her, his mind racing. A contract marriage? This woman, clearly a millionaire, wanted to marry him for 1 month, and in return, he would be free from his financial struggles? It sounded like something out of a movie, too good to be true. Mark sat back, his thoughts racing. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing on him. He wasn't sure about the idea of marrying a woman he didn't know, but he was running out of options. His mother's medical bills, his school fees, and the constant pressure of living paycheck to paycheck were starting to break him. This offer, as strange as it was, might be the only chance he had to turn things around. Eleanor's lips curled into a small, approving smile. As they shook hands, Mark couldn't help but wonder what this arrangement would mean for his life. He was about to marry a woman he barely knew, someone who wasn't looking for love, but merely a companion. He had no idea how things would unfold, but one thing was certain: his life was about to change in ways he never expected. Mark couldn't shake the thought that this strange business arrangement might just be the beginning of something bigger, something he wasn't prepared for. The following evening, Mark stood outside Brooks' Bistro, staring up at the tall building, feeling the weight of the decision he'd made. He had agreed to marry a woman he barely knew, for 1 month, just to solve his financial problems. His heart was pounding, and his thoughts were all over the place. He still couldn't believe he had said yes. There was something about Eleanor Brooks' confidence, her calm demeanor, that made it hard to turn down her offer. But still, the reality of it was sinking in. He was about to marry a stranger, a woman who had no interest in love, just a business arrangement. His stomach churned as he pushed open the door and stepped inside. Eleanor was already waiting at their usual corner table, her silver hair gleaming under the soft restaurant lights, dressed in a sleek black dress that screamed elegance. She looked up as he approached, her expression unreadable, but there was a glint of approval in her eyes. Mark nodded, trying to keep his nerves in check. He sat down opposite her, his mind racing as he tried to understand what had led him here. His thoughts kept going back to the conversation they'd had the night before. Eleanor had made it clear that this wasn't about love. It wasn't about romance. It was a business deal, pure and simple. He was just a pawn in her plan to protect her wealth and legacy. And yet, for some reason, he couldn't shake the feeling that this deal might change more than just his financial future. Mark looked at the papers in front of him, his hand hovering over the pen. He had to admit, the offer was tempting. He had no other way out of the mess his life had become. His mother's medical bills, his student loans, the rent he couldn't pay, it was all too much. But there was still a part of him that felt uneasy. He couldn't help but wonder what it would be like living under the same roof as Eleanor. What kind of woman was she, really? And how would he feel living with someone who had no interest in love or even companionship? It wasn't a typical marriage, but it was the only option he had. Eleanor looked at him with a slight smile, as if she had anticipated this question. She leaned back in her chair, her posture relaxed, but her gaze intense. Mark nodded slowly, still unsure of what to think. Eleanor had made it sound so simple, but there was a nagging feeling in the back of his mind. Could he really go through with this? Could he live with a woman who had no interest in him beyond this contract? He pushed the doubts aside. He needed this. He needed the money, the stability, the chance to rebuild his life. As Eleanor handed him the papers, her smile widened just a little. For a moment, he just stared at the papers in front of him, as if trying to comprehend what he had just agreed to. This was it. His life was about to change, whether he was ready or not. He glanced up at Eleanor, who was already gathering the papers with a sense of purpose. There was no warmth in her expression, but there was something in her eyes, something that made him wonder if she, too, was feeling the weight of this arrangement. The next few weeks passed in a blur. Mark moved into Eleanor's luxurious estate, a sprawling mansion that felt more like a museum than a home. The first few days were a whirlwind of meetings, adjustments, and awkward silences. He tried to settle into his new life, but it felt strange, living under the same roof as a woman he barely knew, a woman who was only interested in him as a business partner. He stayed in a guest room, and Eleanor kept to her own schedule, hardly acknowledging his presence unless it was necessary. Mark kept himself busy, trying to focus on his studies and his new life. But it wasn't long before the reality of living with Eleanor began to sink in. They were living together, yet they were still strangers to each other. There were no late-night conversations, no casual exchanges. It was as if they were both walking around in separate worlds, bound together by a contract but disconnected in every other way. But one evening, everything changed. Eleanor called him down to dinner, and for the first time since they'd signed the papers, there was an unspoken tension in the air. Mark had noticed that her demeanor had softened in recent days, and tonight, as they sat down to eat, she seemed different. Less distant. He wondered if the same transformation was happening within him. As they ate, Eleanor finally spoke. Mark looked up, surprised. For the first time since meeting her, he saw a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. She wasn't just the powerful, untouchable woman who had made this offer. She was human, too, struggling with something he hadn't expected. The realization hit him like a wave. Maybe this contract was the start of something neither of them could have predicted. Maybe this wasn't just about money and convenience. Maybe, just maybe, it could lead to something more. The next few days were a blur for Mark. He spent most of his time holed up in his room, working on his law school assignments, trying to distract himself from the growing tension between him and Eleanor. Their marriage was still a business arrangement, no love, no affection, just two people coexisting under the same roof. But something had shifted since their dinner a few nights ago. Eleanor's walls seemed to be coming down, little by little, and Mark couldn't help but notice. The cold, distant woman who had proposed the marriage had started to open up in small ways, like when she asked him about his day or offered him a genuine smile as they crossed paths in the hallway. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make him wonder if the contract they had signed could turn into something more. He tried not to read too much into it. After all, she had made it clear from the beginning that this was just a business deal. But the longer he stayed, the more he felt that he was becoming a part of her life. It was hard to ignore. The tension between them was slowly giving way to a strange, unspoken connection. And then one evening, as he was making his way down to the dining room for dinner, he caught sight of Eleanor in the living room, standing by the window, gazing out at the sprawling estate. She didn't hear him approach, and for a moment, he just watched her. There was something about the way she stood there, so lost in thought, that made him feel like he was seeing her for the first time. She wasn't just the powerful CEO anymore. She was a woman who carried a heavy burden. He wasn't sure what it was, but something in him softened as he walked over to her. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his voice quiet, unsure of how to break the silence. Eleanor turned, surprised, but the look in her eyes wasn't one of annoyance, as it often had been when they first met. Instead, there was something more vulnerable. She nodded slowly, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "Just thinking," she said. "About everything, I suppose. This marriage, the future, it's all a bit overwhelming." Mark stood there for a moment, not sure what to say. He had never expected to be a part of her world like this. She wasn't just the woman who had paid off his debts and given him a place to stay. She was someone who needed help, someone who, despite all her wealth and power, had her own struggles. And in that moment, he realized that he couldn't just stay detached. He couldn't ignore the fact that he was starting to care about her. Slowly, he walked over to where she stood, looking out at the garden, the soft light from the setting sun casting a golden glow over everything. "I don't know if this is what you need to hear right now," he said, his voice low. "But I'm here. I don't want to just be your husband on paper. I want to help. If you need someone to talk to, I'm listening." Eleanor turned to him then, her expression unreadable at first. But something in her eyes softened, and she stepped closer to him. For a moment, they just stood there in silence, the world outside forgotten. The connection between them was growing stronger, and neither of them could deny it. Finally, Eleanor spoke. "I didn't expect this," she said softly. "I didn't expect you to care. I never thought I'd need anyone," but now, she trailed off, her voice breaking slightly. Mark felt a rush of emotions he hadn't anticipated: empathy, tenderness, and a growing sense of affection. "You don't have to go through everything alone," he said quietly. "You don't have to be strong all the time. It's okay to let someone in." For the first time in weeks, Eleanor's guard seemed to drop. She looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, Mark saw the cracks in her facade. It was like he had reached a part of her that no one else had ever seen. Eleanor didn't say anything more, but the silence between them was comfortable now, not awkward. As they stood there, Mark felt a shift in their relationship. What had started as a contract business arrangement was beginning to feel more like a real marriage. They had connected on a deeper level, and for the first time, he wondered if this strange, unexpected marriage could turn into something meaningful. But there was still so much they didn't know about each other. There were still secrets, unresolved feelings, and a lot of emotional walls to break down. Neither of them was ready to admit that yet, but the seed of something real had been planted. And as the night drew on, Mark couldn't help but feel that this was the beginning of something new, something neither of them had planned for. A marriage of convenience was turning into something more than just a contract. It was slowly becoming a relationship. And for the first time, he wasn't sure what the future held, but he was beginning to believe it might just be worth the risk. The days that followed were marked by a strange, unspoken understanding between Mark and Eleanor. There was no clear definition of what their relationship was anymore. What had started as a simple contract, two people bound by a business deal, had slowly morphed into something more complicated, more meaningful. Mark found himself spending more time with Eleanor, not just as her husband on paper, but as someone she began to trust. They shared quiet moments, their conversations growing deeper with each passing day. Eleanor, despite her strong exterior, began to let her guard down, and Mark found himself wanting to be there for her in ways he hadn't expected. The walls between them were coming down, brick by brick. One evening, after dinner, Eleanor invited Mark to join her in the study. The room was cozy, lined with bookshelves, and the faint smell of aged leather filled the air. She was seated at her desk, reviewing some papers, when he walked in. She looked up and smiled faintly, but there was something different about her, something softer. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "About us. This whole situation." Mark leaned against the doorframe, watching her carefully. "What do you mean?" he asked, unsure of where this conversation was headed. Eleanor paused for a moment, as if choosing her words carefully. "I never imagined I'd be in this position. You've been here for a while now, and it's different. I thought this would just be a transaction. A way to solve my problems. But it's not. It's more complicated than that." Mark's heart skipped a beat. He had felt the shift, the growing connection between them, but hearing Eleanor admit it aloud made it real. He walked into the room and sat down across from her. "You don't have to explain," he said softly. "I get it. This wasn't what either of us expected. But somehow, it's become more than just a contract. At least, for me." There was a long pause as Eleanor looked at him, her gaze searching his face. "You're not like the others, Mark," she said quietly. "You don't look at me like I'm just a businesswoman. You don't want anything from me except, well, my company, I suppose." Mark smiled gently. "I'm not here for your company, Eleanor. I'm here because I care about you." "I didn't expect that either. But it's true." Eleanor looked down at the papers in front of her, and Mark could see the weight of her thoughts pressing on her. "I've spent so long building my empire, Mark," she said softly, "and I've been so focused on keeping control, on being strong, that I've forgotten what it means to rely on someone else. To let someone in." Mark reached out, his hand resting gently on the desk between them. "It's okay to let someone in," he said. "You don't have to do it all on your own." For a moment, there was only silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like a shared understanding, an unspoken agreement that they were beginning to trust each other more than they ever had before. Eleanor finally lifted her gaze, meeting his eyes. "I don't know where this is going," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't want to pretend anymore. I don't want to just play this role." Mark nodded, his heart racing as he realized just how much he meant those words. "Neither do I." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning, as if everything had shifted in that one moment. There was no turning back now. They were no longer just two strangers bound by a contract. They had become something more, something real. And as the days passed, their connection deepened. Mark found himself waking up every morning with a sense of anticipation, knowing he would see Eleanor, knowing that their marriage, whether they had intended it or not, was slowly transforming into something genuine. Eleanor, for the first time in a long while, allowed herself to feel the warmth of his presence. She had spent years shutting people out, guarding her heart against any kind of vulnerability. But with Mark, she felt something different. She felt safe. He didn't judge her for the decisions she had made. He didn't see her as just a wealthy woman. He saw her as Eleanor. For the first time, Eleanor began to question everything she had built her life around. Was it enough? Was the empire worth sacrificing her happiness? And, more importantly, could she allow herself to love someone who was not just part of her world of business and control? It was a question she wasn't ready to answer yet, but deep down, she knew Mark had changed her in ways she hadn't imagined. As they sat together that evening, sharing stories about their lives, their laughter filled the room. It wasn't just the polite exchanges they had started with. It was real, unguarded, and filled with the warmth of two people who had started as strangers but were now becoming something much more than that. As the weeks passed, the lines between what was real and what was just part of their agreement started to blur for both Mark and Eleanor. It had been almost 2 months since they signed the contract, and what had started as a business arrangement was now something neither of them had anticipated. Eleanor had slowly begun to trust Mark in ways she hadn't allowed herself to trust anyone in years. Their conversations deepened, and each day they spent together seemed to break down the walls she had so carefully built around herself. Mark, for his part, found himself falling for Eleanor in ways he never expected. Despite the initial shock of their arrangement, he had grown to admire her strength, her intelligence, and even her vulnerability. They had become more than just a couple living under the same roof. They were partners, in a sense, though neither of them had said the word out loud. One afternoon, Mark walked into the library of Eleanor's mansion, looking for her. He found her sitting at the grand wooden desk, papers spread out in front of her, but she wasn't working. She was just sitting there, staring at the documents with a far-off look in her eyes. Her usual confidence seemed to have faded, replaced by something he couldn't quite place. "Eleanor," he called gently, and she looked up, startled. She smiled weakly. "Sorry, I didn't hear you." He moved closer, noticing the tiredness in her eyes. It had been a long week, full of meetings, and the weight of her responsibilities had clearly been getting to her. "What's on your mind?" he asked softly, sitting down beside her. She sighed, folding her hands in front of her. "I've been thinking about this whole situation, Mark. About us. About what we're doing here." Mark raised an eyebrow, surprised by the shift in her tone. "What do you mean?" She looked at him, her expression serious. "I never thought I would let someone into my life like this. I never thought I'd let anyone in at all, really. But you." She paused, as if searching for the right words. "You've made me question everything. I've built this life, this empire, and I've always thought that it was enough. But now, I'm not so sure." Mark's heart began to race. He could hear the uncertainty in her voice, the crack in her armor. He wanted to reach out, to comfort her, but he didn't want to push her. "I didn't come here looking for anything, Eleanor," he said, his voice steady. "I came here because you needed someone. And now, I can't imagine my life without you." Eleanor's eyes softened, and for a moment, it felt like the entire world outside the room had faded away. There were no business deals, no deadlines, no pressures. It was just the two of them, standing on the precipice of something neither of them had planned for. She stood up slowly, walking over to the window and staring out at the view of the sprawling estate. Mark followed her, standing at her side, his presence silent but supportive. "I've spent so much of my life trying to control everything," Eleanor continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't control this. I can't control how I feel about you." Mark's breath caught in his throat. He had been waiting for this moment, but hearing her say it out loud made it all the more real. She turned to face him, her eyes locking with his. "Mark," she said softly, "I think I've fallen for you." The words hung in the air, and Mark felt a rush of emotion he hadn't expected. He had known, deep down, that he was falling for her. But hearing her admit it was like a weight lifting off his chest. "I feel the same way," he said, his voice barely a whisper. The connection between them had been growing, but now it was undeniable. They had both changed in ways they hadn't thought possible. Mark had gone from a man desperate to escape his financial struggles to someone who was falling in love with the woman who had once been just a business partner. And Eleanor, the woman who had always kept herself at arm's length from others, was now letting herself feel something real. For the first time in their relationship, they were both truly vulnerable with each other. They stood there, holding each other's gaze, letting the moment linger. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was everything they needed. Finally, Eleanor spoke again, her voice gentle but firm. "I never thought I could be this happy," she said. "Not after everything I've been through. But you've shown me that there's more to life than just success and power. There's love, and there's trust." Mark smiled, his heart swelling with emotion. "I don't think I could have asked for anything more." They stood there for a while longer, wrapped in the warmth of each other's presence. The world outside continued on, but inside that room, time seemed to stand still. Mark knew that their relationship, their marriage, had evolved into something real. Something worth fighting for. Eleanor had opened up to him in a way she never had before, and for the first time, Mark felt like he wasn't just a contract. He was her partner, her equal, and as they stood together, he couldn't help but believe that this whatever it was the beginning of something even bigger than either of them could have imagined. The days following that moment felt different for both Mark and Eleanor. What had once been a carefully constructed arrangement between them now seemed to flow more naturally. Their interactions weren't just out of obligation or convenience, they were real, filled with warmth and mutual understanding. They spent more time together, talking about things beyond their deal, beyond the business arrangements. There were quiet mornings with coffee in hand, casual walks through the gardens, and laughter shared over dinner. Eleanor had started to let her guard down even further, showing Mark sides of herself he never knew existed. He had always seen her as the powerful CEO who had everything under control, but now, she was revealing her vulnerabilities. She talked about her childhood, about the sacrifices she had made to get where she was, and the loneliness she often felt at the top. Mark listened attentively, feeling a growing affection for her. He had fallen for her long ago, but now, it wasn't just about attraction. It was about the person she was, the woman who had built an empire, yes, but also the woman who had once been just like him, struggling to find a place in the world. One evening, as they sat in the living room, sipping wine by the fire, Eleanor turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "Mark, do you ever think about what happens after this marriage?" she asked softly. Mark looked up from his glass, surprised by the question. "What do you mean?" he asked, his brow furrowing. Eleanor sighed, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. "I never thought I'd be in a real marriage. I didn't expect to feel this way about you." She paused, as if weighing her words. "I thought this was just a contract. But now, I'm not sure anymore. I feel like I've started to depend on you." Mark's heart skipped a beat. "Eleanor," he said gently, setting his glass down, "this is real, isn't it? I mean, we didn't plan for it, but what we have know it's not just a deal anymore. It's something real." Eleanor's gaze softened, and for a moment, she looked vulnerable, something she rarely showed. "I know," she whispered. "And I don't know what to do with it. I didn't think I could let someone in, but here you are, and I find myself wanting more." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Mark reached out, his hand covering hers gently. "You don't have to have it all figured out," he said. "We don't have to know what comes next. All I know is that I want to be with you, Eleanor." She smiled softly, her eyes shining with emotion. "I want that too," she said quietly. And just like that, they both knew that whatever had started as a contractual agreement was now something that couldn't be easily undone. As the weeks went by, they continued to grow closer. The boundaries between business and personal were becoming less distinct, and their feelings for each other deepened. Mark's affection for Eleanor was no longer just about her wealth or the security she had given him. It was about the way she made him feel seen, heard, and understood. And for Eleanor, it was about discovering that she didn't need to be alone, that she could let someone into her life and her heart without sacrificing her strength or independence. One afternoon, Eleanor asked Mark to join her at a charity event she was hosting. It was a large gala, filled with high-profile business leaders, philanthropists, and influencers. Mark had never been to anything like it, and he felt out of place in the sea of polished suits and glittering jewelry. But as he walked beside Eleanor, her hand gently resting in his, he realized that he didn't care about the status or the glitz. He cared about her. And that was enough. The night of the gala was a whirlwind of conversations, speeches, and the usual formalities. But through it all, Mark couldn't help but notice how different Eleanor was with him by her side. She was still the powerful woman everyone knew her to be, but when they were together, there was a softness to her, a tenderness that she reserved only for him. At one point during the event, Eleanor stepped away to speak with one of her colleagues. Mark stood by the bar, sipping his drink and taking in the room. As he looked around, he noticed the admiring glances of others, the way they respected Eleanor for what she had built. But none of it mattered to him. What mattered was the woman he was standing beside, the woman who had once been his savior and now was becoming so much more. Later that evening, Eleanor returned to his side, a smile on her lips. "You okay?" she asked, her voice soft. Mark nodded, a grin spreading across his face. "I'm good. Just happy to be here with you." She reached out and took his hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "I'm glad you're here too." The night ended with them walking out into the cool night air, hand in hand. As they drove back to her estate, the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, it was peaceful, filled with the unspoken understanding that something had shifted between them. They had started this journey as strangers, bound by a contract. But now, they were two people who had found something more than they ever expected. And as the car pulled into the driveway, Mark knew that he didn't want to go anywhere without her. Their story, whatever it was becoming, was just beginning. As the weeks passed, Mark and Eleanor continued to navigate their unexpected relationship. What had once been a contractual arrangement now felt more like a genuine partnership. They spent more time together, sharing their hopes, fears, and dreams in ways they had never expected. The walls that had separated them were slowly crumbling, replaced by a growing connection that neither of them had anticipated. Eleanor, once so controlled and distant, began to show a side of herself that was more vulnerable. She let Mark see the moments of doubt and insecurity that she had kept hidden for so long. She told him about the weight of her responsibilities, the loneliness that often accompanied her success, and the fear that she would never truly be understood. Mark, for his part, had always admired Eleanor's strength, but now he saw her in a new light. She wasn't just the powerful CEO, she was a woman who had worked hard to build an empire but had paid a heavy price in the process. And as he spent more time with her, he began to fall for her in ways he never expected. But despite their growing closeness, there was still an underlying tension. Mark had always known that Eleanor's past, her ambition, and her dedication to her career had shaped her, but there was something deeper, something unspoken, that kept her from fully embracing the love that was blossoming between them. It was as if she was afraid to let go of control, to fully surrender herself to the idea of a real, deep connection. One evening, as they sat on the balcony of Eleanor's estate, overlooking the city lights below, Mark finally brought up the one thing that had been on his mind for weeks. "Eleanor," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I think we need to talk about where we're going from here." Eleanor turned to look at him, her eyes soft but filled with uncertainty. "What do you mean?" she asked. Mark took a deep breath, searching for the right words. "I know we started this as a contract, but what we have know it's real. And I think we need to decide what we want moving forward. Do we keep pretending this is just a business arrangement, or do we take the next step and see where this goes?" There was a long silence as Eleanor processed his words. The wind gently ruffled her hair, and for a moment, she seemed lost in thought. Mark waited, his heart racing as he tried to gauge her reaction. Finally, Eleanor spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been thinking about that too," she said. "I've been so focused on keeping control of everything in my life that I never stopped to think about what I wanted. And now, I'm not sure. I don't know if I can let go of everything I've worked for, everything I've built." Mark reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "You don't have to let go of everything, Eleanor. You don't have to change who you are. But maybe it's time to let someone else in. Maybe it's time to let me in." Eleanor looked down at their intertwined hands, her thumb lightly tracing his fingers. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," she admitted softly. "I've spent my whole life building this world, and I'm scared that if I open up, I'll lose everything." Mark squeezed her hand, his voice full of understanding. "I'm not asking you to lose anything, Eleanor. I'm asking you to let someone share it with you. To let me be a part of your life. A real part of it." For a moment, Eleanor remained silent, her gaze fixed on their hands. Then, slowly, she raised her eyes to meet his, and in that moment, Mark saw something shift in her. It was subtle, but it was there, as softening, a willingness to let go of some of the control she had held onto for so long. Maybe I'm ready," she whispered. Mark's heart soared, but he didn't want to rush her. He knew that this was a big step for her, and he didn't want to pressure her into anything she wasn't ready for. "Whenever you are," he said gently. "We'll go at your pace." They sat together in comfortable silence, the night air cool around them as the city lights twinkled below. Mark didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, he felt more certain than ever that he wanted to be a part of Eleanor's life no matter what. For Eleanor, it was a leap of faith. She had always kept herself at a distance, afraid of what might happen if she let someone in. But now, as she sat beside Mark, feeling the warmth of his hand in hers, she realized that maybe, just maybe, it was worth the risk. The next morning, Eleanor woke up with a sense of calm she hadn't felt in years. The weight of her decisions seemed a little lighter, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to feel hopeful. Maybe it wasn't about losing control. Maybe it was about sharing control. About finding someone who would stand beside her, not beneath her. As she prepared for the day ahead, she couldn't help but smile to herself. The future, whatever it was, felt a little brighter. The following days were filled with a newfound sense of peace and purpose for Eleanor and Mark. For the first time since they had signed their contract, their relationship was no longer just about convenience or necessity. It had transformed into something deeper, something real. Eleanor, who had spent years building her empire alone, was slowly learning to share her world with Mark. She had always feared that letting someone in would make her vulnerable, but now, she felt a shift inside her. She didn't have to be strong all the time. She didn't have to control everything. There was space for love, for trust, and for connection. Mark, for his part, had never imagined this journey would lead him to a woman like Eleanor. What had started as a way out of his financial troubles had turned into a life-changing experience. He had grown to admire Eleanor not just for her strength and success but for the person she was underneath it all, the woman who cared deeply, the woman who had dreams and fears like anyone else. Their bond had grown stronger, built on mutual respect and an unspoken understanding. One afternoon, as they sat together in Eleanor's study, the air was filled with a calm that had settled between them over the last few weeks. Eleanor looked up from her papers, meeting Mark's gaze. She smiled softly, a quiet warmth in her eyes. "Mark," she began, her voice steady, "I've been thinking a lot about everything. About us." Mark set down his book and leaned forward, giving her his full attention. He knew that tone. It was the kind of tone that signified something important was about to be said. "What about us?" he asked. Eleanor took a deep breath before continuing, as if weighing her words carefully. "I know that I've always been focused on my work, on building my business and my legacy. But lately, I've realized that there's something more important than all of that." She paused, her eyes locking with his. "There's you. There's us." Mark's heart skipped a beat. He had always hoped for this moment, but hearing her say it out loud made it feel real. "Eleanor, I've never wanted anything from you except the chance to be with you," he said, his voice slow and sincere. "I never expected to find something so real, so deep, but here we are." Eleanor smiled, the weight of her own words sinking in. "I think I've been afraid," she admitted softly. "Afraid of losing myself, of losing control. But I realize now that letting someone in doesn't mean losing myself. It means gaining something, something I never thought I would have." Mark's chest tightened as he looked at her, the vulnerability in her eyes reaching him in a way nothing else ever had. "I don't want you to lose yourself, Eleanor. I just want to be with you, to be a part of your life." She nodded, a small tear glistening in her eye. "And I want that too, more than I ever thought I could." The silence that followed was not one of discomfort, but of understanding. For the first time, Eleanor wasn't holding back. She wasn't hiding behind the walls she had so carefully constructed over the years. And for the first time, Mark felt like he was truly a part of her life, not just as her contract husband, but as her partner, her equal. The next evening, they attended a gala that Eleanor had organized for one of her charity foundations. The room was filled with high-profile guests, elegant decor, and the usual buzz of conversation, but as they walked through the crowd, hand in hand, Mark couldn't help but notice how different it all felt. Eleanor, the powerful CEO, the woman who had always been in control, was now walking beside him, vulnerable yet confident, ready to embrace the love they had found. They stood together at the front of the room, looking out over the sea of guests. Mark couldn't help but smile. The life he had once thought of as impossible to escape was now a distant memory. He was no longer that desperate man. He was part of something greater, something that was built on love, trust, and a bond that was growing stronger every day. Later that evening, as the gala came to a close, Eleanor turned to Mark, her smile genuine, her eyes soft. "I never imagined it would be like this," she said quietly. "I didn't know I could have this happiness, this love." Mark squeezed her hand gently. "I think we both found something we didn't expect," he said, his voice full of warmth. Eleanor leaned in, kissing him softly on the cheek. "Thank you for showing me what it means to truly live." As they left the event together, walking hand in hand, Mark knew that this was just the beginning. Their marriage, their relationship, it was no longer a contract. It was a promise. A promise to be there for each other, to trust, to love, and to build a future together. The past had shaped them, but it no longer defined them. They were free to create something new, something beautiful. And as they walked into the future, side by side, Mark knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together. Months passed, and Mark and Eleanor's relationship continued to evolve in ways neither of them had imagined. What had started as a simple, contractual arrangement was now a deep, meaningful partnership. They had built something real, something that couldn't be undone with a signature on a piece of paper. Eleanor had never been one to show vulnerability, but with Mark, she felt safe enough to let down her guard. She had found not only a partner but someone who truly understood her. And Mark, once struggling with debts and uncertainty, had found someone who cared for him in a way he had never expected. As they navigated life together, their connection grew stronger with each passing day. They traveled together, shared their dreams, and built a future that was no longer based on an agreement but on love, trust, and mutual respect. Eleanor had let go of her fear of losing control, realizing that being with Mark didn't mean sacrificing everything she had worked for. It meant gaining something even more valuable. One evening, as they sat together on the terrace overlooking the city, Mark turned to Eleanor with a thoughtful expression. "Do you remember when we first met?" he asked, his voice soft. Eleanor smiled, her eyes glistening with emotion. "How could I forget?" she said with a gentle laugh. "You were a complete stranger, and I was offering you a life-changing deal." Mark chuckled, shaking his head. "And now look at us," he said, reaching for her hand. "We started as strangers, bound by a contract, and now we're building a life together." Eleanor's smile widened, her heart full. "It's hard to believe how much has changed," she said. "I never thought I could be this happy, but with you, everything feels different." Mark squeezed her hand, his eyes locked with hers. "You've shown me that happiness isn't just about money or success," he said. "It's about finding someone who makes you feel seen, who makes you feel like you matter." Eleanor's voice trembled slightly as she spoke. "I never thought I could find that. But here we are." They sat in silence for a few moments, simply enjoying each other's presence. The future felt bright, filled with possibilities. They had come a long way since that first meeting, and Eleanor couldn't help but feel a sense of peace settle over her. She had once been afraid of letting someone in, of sharing her world. But now, with Mark by her side, she understood that love wasn't something to be feared, it was something to be embraced. "I don't know what the future holds," she said, breaking the silence, "but I know one thing for sure, I want to face it with you." Mark smiled, his heart swelling with affection for her. "I feel the same way," he said. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." That night, as they went to bed, Eleanor rested her head on Mark's chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. The fears that had once held her back, the doubts she had carried for so long, seemed to fade away in his embrace. She knew they had built something beautiful, something lasting, and it was only the beginning. The next morning, they woke up to a new day, hand in hand, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Their journey together was far from over, but it was a journey they would walk side by side, with love and trust guiding them every step of the way. Mark had come into Eleanor's life as a stranger, but now, he was her partner in every sense of the word. And for the first time, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. As they walked through the garden together, laughing and talking, it was clear that their love had transformed them both. They had started with a simple agreement, but now, they had something far more meaningful, a partnership built on trust, love, and the willingness to take risks for each other. Their future was uncertain, but it didn't matter. Together, they were unstoppable.